I welcome honorable speakers of this session. First, I welcome Professor Ravi Gupta. Let me introduce one of the prominent speaker. He holds the Red Charles Chair of Religious Studies and serves as Director of the Religious Studies program at Utah State University. He has various accolades and various feathers to his head. He is permanent research fellow of the Export Center for Hindu Studies and a past president of the Society for Hindu-Christian Studies. His current research focuses on Bhagavata Purana, Sanskrit commentaries. He enjoys teaching world religions, Hinduism, Sanskrit and religious studies, and theory and method. Now I pass on the session for presentation to Professor Gupta. Before that, I would like to say that you have 20 minutes, sir. Now over to Professor Gupta.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi, for the kind introduction. I want to especially thank Dr. Ramesh Goyal for inviting me to this conference and to his entire team for organizing it. I won't spend too long in introduction since we have a short amount of time. The title of my presentation is Building Blocks of a Vaishnav Eco-Theology. And basically, I want to talk about 4 things here with you. First of all, just briefly discuss the importance of theology, religious perspectives on environmental sustainability, especially in the Indian context. Secondly, I want to point to some building blocks of a specifically Vaishnav eco-theology. And third, I want to point to potential problem areas in terms of eco-theology and Vaishnavism. And finally, leave some time for questions. So I'm going to do all of that in the space of, well, I think including the questions, we have 30 minutes. So let's see how quickly we can get through the time we have here. So the first thing to mention is that our religious or spiritual perspective, our theological perspective on the environment directly affects how we treat the environment and how we coexist with it. There's a lot of research behind this that has provided evidence that, especially in the Indian context, religion and spirituality are key partners in the effort for sustainability. It's not something, religion is not on the sidelines as a cheerleader or merely as a supporting element, but really a direct actor, an agent in the process of building and changing attitudes towards the environment and ecological care. And theology in particular, that is how we see the natural environment, how we see the world in relation to God and in relation to the place of human beings in this. Those theological perspectives, have direct impact, particularly. Some research that I think is very useful in this regard, since there's very little I can say at this point, I would rather point you to other resources. Dr. David Haberman at the University of Indiana, Bloomington, has written several books on this, but one in particular that's quite useful is called River of Love in an Age of Pollution, the Yamuna River of Northern India, where he's provided a study of Yamuna ecology, both in terms of the severe pollution that we find in the Yamuna River, and and also at the same time, the way in which Yamuna worship and reverence for the Yamuna directly impacts ecological care as well as ecological destruction. One of the things he points out there, which I think gives a really fine example of how theology directly impacts this, directly impacts our environmentalism, is he talks about how when he was doing a research on attitudes towards the Yamuna, he found basically 3 different kinds of attitudes that were prevalent amongst Yamuna worshippers. The first attitude, so when confronted with the pollution that the Yamuna was facing, people gave three different kinds of responses that showed a different kind of theology in relation to the Yamuna River. The first response he would get when he would bring up Yamuna's pollution was the attitude that was the response was the Yamuna cannot be polluted. No matter whatever dirt we put into the Yamuna River becomes purified, it becomes cleansed by the power of the river goddess herself. And just as she purifies negative karma, and just as she purifies the heart of those who enter her waters, so she also purifies any physical forms of pollution that we might place within her. The second attitude that he documented was people acknowledging the fact that it was possible for the river to be polluted, but the pollution did not affect the Yamuna herself. It did not affect the river goddess herself. Rather, the pollution was something that affected us. When we put it there, we were affected by it. And a good example of this would be along the lines of light pollution, that when we're in a large city, it's impossible to see the stars because of all the artificial lights that are present at night. Those lights don't affect the stars themselves. They stay far beyond any of that. They glow brightly on their own strength. The only person it affects is us because we can't see the stars at night. So using that metaphor, some people he spoke to argued that the Yamuna herself was not affected by the pollution. It was us who were going to be affected and diseased, etc., by using her waters or bathing within them. And then the third perspective that he encountered was people saying that, yes, indeed, the Yamuna herself was suffering from pollution, and arguing that the Yamuna is our mother. She has been a river, a goddess, our Mata for centuries. She is our mother. She has been generously providing for us in terms of her, water that sustains life, that gives us spiritual sustenance as well, and sustaining civilization upon her banks, irrigating farmland, etc. As a mother, she has been giving and providing for centuries. And now our mother is sick. She's ailing, she's diseased. And moreover, she's sick, she's ailing because of our actions, because of our mistreatment of her. So is it not our duty, therefore, to take care of her? So the idea that Yamuna is actually sick, that she's dying as a result of our action, and that she is a goddess and yet she's been affected by us, this was the third perspective he encountered. Now, as you might probably guess here, these various audiences had different levels of concern and care for the cleanup of the Yamuna. And the first category that I mentioned was the least likely to take any action in regard to Yamuna pollution, the category that denied that any pollution was even possible because she was a goddess. At the second category, second sort of response was more likely to react, the view that said she is unaffected, but it does affect us. And the most environmentally active was the third perspective, which considered that the river herself, the goddess herself, was affected negatively by our actions. So the only reason I mention this is simply to say that there is a direct correlation between our religious and spiritual perspectives and our responses to the environment and to ecological care. So these two things are not separable, and this is why it's very important to examine religious, spiritual, theological perspectives in relation to the natural world, as we are doing in this entire panel today. Now, what are some of those theological perspectives in the Vaishnava traditions that help support environmental care? And I mentioned the Vaishnava perspectives, particularly because that's my area of research and that's also the focus of this conference. I want to just point to a few building blocks, and each one of these building blocks I mentioned can be the subject of an entire lecture an exploration of its own, and certainly, academic essays and so forth. But again, my purpose in this presentation is simply to point in various directions for your own exploration. I hope you'll be able to take some of these items and it'll pique your interest, and you're able to move in the directions and explore in the directions that interest you. So there's 3 building blocks that I want to mention here. There's certainly others, but I think 3 will be sufficient for today. First of all is the Vaishnav idea that God is the world. This is something that's actually pan-Indian in terms of pan-Hindu, in terms of the ways that various Hindu traditions think of God in relation to the world. From a Vaishnav perspective, this is most clearly embodied in chapter 11 of Bhagavad Gita, when Krishna shows his Vishvarupa, his cosmic or universal form. And but that vision is repeated over and over again across Vaishnav texts, particularly in the Bhagavata Purana, where we have multiple occasions where the natural world is mapped onto the body of God. And so, along the lines of trees being his hair, the mountains being his bones, the rivers being his veins, etc. And so there's a vision of the natural world that's mapped physically onto the body of God, creating a direct connection between the divine and the human or the cosmos. Further aspects of this element, excuse me, of the relationship between the world and God has to do with Vedantic theology as well, where in most forms of Vaishnav Vedanta, God is not only the nimitta karana, that is, God is not only the agent who creates the world, but he is also its upadana karana, namely the substance of that world itself, right? So to put it in the famous metaphor of the clay and the potter, the Lord is not only the potter who makes the clay pot, but he is also the clay, which is the substance of the pot itself. And again, it is significant that God is given not only agency, but also substance in relation to the world, and it directly provides for a spiritualization of perspectives on the world itself. And finally, particularly in Chaitanya Vaishnava or Gaudiya Vaishnava theology, we have the idea of Shakti, of the world being the energy of God, and therefore eternal, even though it's changing, it's in flux, it's eternal nevertheless, and directly connected to God's being, inherently connected to him. And therefore one can meaningfully say that God is the world. Even though he is more than the world, he is also the world. Now, excuse me, give me just 1 minute here. Now, here's I think the important move in relation to Vaishnava theology. That so how I just got a note that I'm exceeding the time limit. How much time do I have remaining? Can someone clarify?
You have 15 more minutes.
You have time, Prabhu. 15
yeah,
more
you
minutes.
have time. You have 15 more minutes.
Okay, someone just sent me a notice saying I'm exceeding the time limit already. So so it's a 30-minute total period, yes?
Yeah,
including questions? So
Prabhu,
15 minutes.
Prabhu. Yeah, you have 15 more minutes. Go ahead.
Okay. So in this, so here's the crucial move, I think, in relation to God being the world. It's because Vaishnavas regard God as a person. This necessarily means that therefore the world is also personal in nature. Okay. And I've written about this separately in the Journal of Dharma Studies about the impact that this has in terms of Vaishnava theology. So feel free to look up that article published, I think, in the most recent issue of the journal, International Journal of Dharma Studies. But when we think of God as a person, then the world also, and God is the world, therefore the world also becomes personal. And so throughout Vaishnav theology, we find that various aspects of the natural world are personal in their in their conception. And so rivers are goddesses, various physical features of the world, like stones, for example, which are generally relegated to the realm of, dead items, but stones themselves become personal deities. We think here of Shalagram, in particular, Giriraj Shilas, as well as, Shivlingas and so on. And then items like trees as well become personal. Once again, Haberman has done excellent work in this regard by demonstrating. He's written a book on Govardhan Shila in particular, and the impact that has on environmental thought, as well as a book called People Trees, examining trees as persons across Hinduism and across the Indian subcontinent. So this idea of humanizing the world is often a cause for embarrassment in Hindu thought, because it smacks of anthropomorphism for many people. That Hindus worship things as gods. And this embarrassment is really a legacy of colonial studies on Hinduism, where anthropomorphism throughout the history of scientific and humanistic studies, anthropomorphism, seeing the physical objects as having human features, the way that we put eyes on trees or eyes on Govardhan Shilas, anthropomorphism has been seen as something that is embarrassing, that is primitive, that is heathen in nature. And Haberman makes an excellent argument that it is not anthropomorphism which is a problem or that should be a cause for embarrassment, because anthropomorphism has been an ancient human habit across cultures of making the natural environment relatable to human beings. When we put faces on things, we can relate to it. When we see things as persons, it allows us to develop personal relationships and reduces the possibility of exploitation. So think of how in India, when a tree receives a face on it, or it's worshipped as a divinity, as you can find in any village, any town pretty much, it becomes impossible to cut down that tree. And so you find trees growing out of the middle of homes or buildings or businesses, because no one wants to cut down a tree that is seen in personal terms. The same is true with animals. The same is true with other physical elements. When we make them personal, when we see them in human ways, then it becomes more challenging. It can still be done, but it becomes more challenging to then harm it in various ways. The problem is not anthropomorphism, but anthropocentrism. That is the idea that human beings are at the center of creation and all things are meant for human exploitation or engagement or pleasure or use. This creates a consumerist attitude towards the environment, which is problematic. So again, two key terms, anthropomorphism versus anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism being problematic in this context. Anthropomorphism, although historically embarrassing for a lot of people, is something that ought to be embraced and something that ought to be, in fact, developed and promoted and used. And then the last thing I want to mention, which I'm going to say very briefly, is to say that our vision of ultimate reality is set in natural surroundings. So from a Vaishnava perspective, ultimate reality, that is the vision of what is paradise. This is for Vaishnavas, the idea of Vaikuntha or of Vrindavana or Golok Vrindavana. In all of these perspectives, the descriptions that we find in the Bhagavata of that ultimate reality are always set in a naturally idyllic environment. And in contrast, pretty much every account that we hear of demonic activity, the demons of the Bhagavata Purana and other Puranas, whether they be Hiranyakashipu or Ravana or so on, always correlate with severe destruction of environmental surroundings. And so one of my favorite passages is with Hiranyakashipu, who is specifically described in the Bhagavata as being destructive of the earth's trees in many ways, and all aspects of the natural environment. Okay, last thing, two problematic, before we open to questions, two problematic areas in the literature that have been pointed out by scholars as being potential problems for Vaishnava theology in relation to its environment, since I think for any academic presentation, we wouldn't just want to give the positive elements here. The first that has been pointed out in the literature, particularly by Dr. Lance Nelson in his article in the book Hinduism and Ecology, he points out that the Vaishnava and broadly Hindu idea that the world is a miserable place is Dukhalayam Ashashvatam, for example, in the Gita. This is problematic in terms of why should we care for the world when it's going to be a miserable, terrible place anyway, it discourages attempts to make it better. And this is definitely an issue that needs to be a concern for Vaishnava theology, Vaishnava practitioners in terms of attitudes towards the world as being inherently negative. However, I think that one way in which this can be used beneficially is that it often helps to temper expectations for how much we can improve things in the world. One of the things that's commonly known in environmentalist circles is a sense of hopelessness, how much, no matter what we try to do, the world's ecological condition seems to constantly deteriorate. And some recognition that that is inevitable, that we can help slow the process, we can perhaps even reverse it, but it's not going to be entirely perfect because that's the nature of the world, can actually help in that regard. The second problematic area that has been pointed out is the philosophy of Vairagya, or detachment from the world. If the world is something that ought to be detached from, as Vaishnava theology points out, for everyone, I mean, particularly for sannyasis and renunciants, but also for the average practitioner developing a gradual attitude of detachment from the world, then why ought we be engaged in preserving or flourishing the world if we need to escape it anyway? And this is, again, something that I encourage all of us to take seriously as a problematic attitude that, in my experience, has often discouraged people from taking the environment seriously. Once again here, I think there's a useful element of Vairagya that can be used not negatively, but positively in ecological care. And that has to do with the Vairagya's natural ability to work against consumerism, to encourage an attitude of simplicity and minimalism in relation to our ecological footprint, by saying it's not how much we can consume, but how little we can consume, not how much we can eat, but how long we can fast, not how much we can sleep, but how little we can sleep. That is really a marker of our success in this world. So Vairagya has its benefits, but when used in a sense of, well, the world doesn't really matter because we have to escape it anyway, can be quite problematic in relation to the environment. So those are two problematic areas that I wanted to mention, and we are working just perfectly in time. There were 4 things I wanted to cover, each for 5 minutes long, and we now have 5 minutes left for questions or comments that anyone wants to make.
Yes. So iPhone, no name is there. If he wants to raise, he has raised his hand. So want to ask any question?
So the chat window has been opened. So now the people can write in the chat box, and then either MC or the chairperson can read through the questions.
And my apologies if that was really fast. It was kind of a whirlwind in terms of what I wanted to point out.
It was really enlightening.
Thank you, thank you. And
So
nothing else, please do look up the references that I mentioned I think that'll be more useful than any content I could
Professor
possibly.
Gupta, we have a question: how to deal with consumer attitude of people towards the environmental resources? From Prekshayas Joshi.
Yeah, so how to change attitudes. This is something that is obviously a great challenge. Here's the thing. Our technological and industrial relationship to the environment changes much faster than cultural and religious attitudes do. So think of, maybe half a century ago when people would eat their food on banana leaves or leaf plates, and after they're done, throw that leaf plate out the window, and that would decompose in very quickly, and or eaten by an animal or something of that sort, and it would be gone. Now, in the past couple decades, those paper plates have those leaf plates have turned into paper plates, which have then turned into plastic plates, and that change of disposable materials has moved so quickly in India and in the world, but attitudes of habit, culture, and practice do not move. Dr. Joshi, would you be able to mute yourself, please? Thank you. But attitudes of behavior don't change just as quickly. And so people still have the habit of throwing the plate out the window after they're done with their meal, but that plate is now made of plastic, which will not decompose in centuries. And so changing cultural attitudes is a slow process, but it's worth the work, because when those attitudes of consumerism gradually change, then they change for a long period of time. So change is slow in culture, but the effects are long lasting.
Hare Krishna, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhu. So we have our next question: how to convince the modern youth about the importance of eco-theology in environmental sustainability?
Okay. How to convince the youth, you said?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So actually, I think convincing the youth is less challenging than convincing those who are not young and in positions of power and influence and direction, because I think there's a growing consciousness amongst young people the world over in terms of importance of ecological care, because we see the consequences of that ecological destruction around us. So really, I think the challenge is, how do we convince those who are already set in their ways from practices in the past that have come from their youth and really have not changed because of the fact that I said cultural change and cultural attitudes is so slow over time. So I'm answering briefly here because I know.
Okay, so we can take one more question. That is very important. How can we make shift of life from city to eco-friendly lifestyle? I think question may not be complete, but you try.
So I really think that the best person to answer that question is our next speaker, Gauranga Prabhu, who has just arrived, because he speaks about this from direct experience and years of practice in putting it into force in an ecologically friendly community, namely Govardhan Eco Village, a place that I visited multiple times and found to be a wonderful exemplar for how Vaishnav theology can be used in the service of positive ecological practices. So let me allow this question to serve as a segue to the next talk, because I know our time is up, and just to offer my endorsement and appreciation, rather, for the work that Govardhan Eco Village has been doing, and that Gauranga Prabhu will now speak about as the next speaker. So thank you so much for your attention. I hope some elements of the talk were useful to you in terms of the various pointers, and I hope you'll have a chance to look up the various references that I pointed out.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. It has been a very interesting and enlightening talk, and you have tackled in a very brief time eco-theology, Yamuna culture, cosmic universe, morphism, and philosophy of Vairagya, everything in a very short span of time. Thank you. We will love to hear you in future also. Thank you so much. So,